Hello and welcome to the Indo-German Business Talk, our monthly webinar format from the Indo-German Centre for Business Excellence. My name is Matthias Catón. I am the Deputy Chairman and Executive Director of the Centre, and I'm also your host here today. I welcome you wherever you are right now in the world. We are based here in Frankfurt on the campus of Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. For those of you who have listened and watched us before, you know that every month we touch upon a topic that is pertinent to Indo-German business relations, and today that topic is digital cooperation. The format is an interactive 45-minute discussion with a group of esteemed experts and panelists here with me, and I will introduce them in a moment. But as always, we also want to hear from you. We have prepared a number of questions that you can answer, and you can also post questions to the panelists through the chat function. We use a service called Slido, and actually I would like to start with the first question already. And the question is, which topic, in your opinion, should be at the top of the Indo-German digital collaboration agenda? And we've prepared a number of options for you, so you can click on whatever you believe is the most important topic. And while you think about it and click, I will introduce our panel. We have three guests today, and I will introduce them now. I will start with Alvis Ancans. He joins us from the European Commission, where he has championed international ICT research and innovation since 2007, so quite a long time, a veteran of digital innovation, I might say. And he is taking the lead as the desk officer for India, and he also brings rich experience as a civil servant from his home country, Latvia. Welcome, Alvis. Great to have you here today.
Good to be with you.
Us. Next is Joel Fernandes. He is the project and policy advisor at Eurochambres, a European advocacy group of chambers of commerce, mainly, I understand. And he has managed pivotal EU-funded projects such as the energy efficiency for SMEs and the India IP SME help desk. He has a career that spans more than 2 decades, and he has been at the forefront of global entities in different parts of the world. Canada, he's been with the World Economic Forum, where both of us worked some time ago. This was where we first met. And he's also a renowned expert for public-private partnerships in international business development. Joel, it's great to see you again.
Good to see you as well.
Our webinar. And finally, we have Anisha Koshy. Anisha joins us from India. She is a senior associate for public policy and privacy at the Data Security Council of India, which belongs to NESCOM. She specializes in areas such as privacy, AI governance, digital ethics. Shouldn't speak so fast. And she delves deep into the realm of digital jurisprudence and the evolving landscape of digital rights. So welcome also to you, Anisha. Great to have you.
Thank you so much.
Here. Now, digital cooperation. Of course, everything digital is on the agenda pretty much everywhere you look. It's a hot topic. It's a very important topic, also an important business force. So let's look for a moment to our poll and see what our participants said. And apparently the data governance and inclusion part seems to be top of mind for our audience, followed by sustainable and emerging technologies and digital business models. So let's maybe start with that. Alvis, given your extensive background working with the European Commission, working on these topics for many, many years, when you look at international cooperation, how do you see India and Germany, or India and Europe, in terms of data governance, privacy issues, and so on? Are the two regions, the countries, are they aligned, or do you see vast discrepancies between the approaches of India and either Germany or the European Union?
Okay, Good morning once again, or good afternoon if you're joining from India. What I'm doing, just basically to give you a context to what I'm doing here, I'm not really very much qualified to speak about specifically German or Indian relations. I'm more overseeing the European Union, European Commission relations with India, which obviously includes Germany. And as far as I know, the priorities that the German government or companies have vis-a-vis India really dovetails with what the European Commission and European Union's priorities are in general. Regarding data governance, platforms governance, this is one of the topics that we have been discussing with India. Obviously, this is an important one. When we speak about the our high-level dialogue, our high-level forum, which is the Trade and Technology Council, these topics have been mentioned, but they were not specifically taken up for follow-up in the first meeting, which happened in May. Nevertheless, we have had contacts and exchanges. Even though, like I said, it wasn't addressed in the first work plan, but we have had contacts and exchanges on these topics, which are important, obviously, particularly in the context of in Digital India Act that I think the Indian government is negotiating at the moment. We might take them up in subsequent Trade and Technology Council meetings, but that is to be validated by both sides. As I mentioned in the first iteration, this has not been the case so far.
You're right to point out that obviously you come from the European angle, not specifically from the German, but I believe that especially when it comes to regulatory issues, a lot of these things are determined on the European level anyway. So to a certain extent, there's not that much difference between what is relevant for Germany and what's regulated on the European level. I mean, from my perspective, and also I think you notice that when you speak to people, also when you travel to India, you speak with Indians and then you speak with Europeans. Sometimes you feel that we're living on different planets. So we have a European approach that is, I might say, rather cautious, places a lot of emphasis on data protection, regulation, also in the field of AI, by the way, something that's popped up recently now. Whereas in India, it seems to be much more a free-for-all. So, you know, there's much less regulation, much less worry also maybe about what happens with data. Joel, you're representing the business side. Do you see that as well? And from a business perspective, is it better to be a European company, or an Indian company when it comes to these issues?
Thanks, Matthias. And I just want to allude to what Alvis just mentioned. You know, I've been working on the EU-India business corridor ever since 2006. I've seen a complete mismatch in terms of policy from both the EU and India in terms of, you know, when they talk about working together. But having said that, that was way back in the past. But now with the whole Trade and Technology Council that Alvis did mention about, and the whole Digital India strategy, the German strategy on the digital strategy for 2025, plus the EU-India connectivity partnership, all of these came out very recently. So having said that, now I would say, yes, there is some kind of alignment between the EU strategy and the Indian strategy, and they're going hand in hand. It was not there in the past, and it's a good sign. And these good signs lead to the businesses wanting to come from the EU to India. And all of the projects that we work on over here at Eurochambres, when it comes to India, whether it is the Clean Energy and Climate Partnership Project, whether it's the India IPSME Help Desk, or whether it is the business support to the EU-India Policy Dialogues Project, which all the three which I managed, I see that there is a lot of appetite now for digital companies to come to India, the clean and emerging technologies to come to India now, because the regulatory framework in India has completely sort of aligned with what the EU is coming out with or has come out with. And we are having this discussion on a very interesting day. Today is the launch of the Global Gateway Business Advisory Group Forum that they're having today in Brussels. And with the Global Gateway, which is another project that is, which is another sort of I would call it a project, focusing on third market countries, India being one of them. There's a huge focus, and today that discussion is taking place today at 1:30 our time here in Brussels. And if you are watching from India or from the EU, I encourage you to take a look at that, because you will hear a lot of the CEOs from the large companies talking about what their interests are in third market countries and what the EU can do. So that's the reason why today is a very important day. In terms of businesses, yes, I see a huge influx or an exodus of companies from the EU going to India, particularly the SMEs. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Anisha, is that something you would agree with? Are Europeans and Indians really completely aligned now when it comes to these issues?
No, I think there are, in terms of, as Joel was mentioning, yes, across some regulations, I think there is broad alignment. But I think if you look at large-scale legislations, India has gone away from a Eurocentric approach. And I think that's a very cautious and very informed decision that India has made, in fact, right? So I think if you looked at, we've had 4 or 5 iterations of the data protection bill, which is our version of the DPDP, as it's called, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. And we've had, I think, 4 iterations of it that came out for public consultation. And if you look at the initial or the first kind of drafts of it, they were almost mirror copies of the GDPR, right? In sort of spirit, essence, principle, it echoed what the GDPR had already set as precedent for the European countries. And we were kind of, in a lot of ways, aping that. And I think if you look at the version of the law now, which is a very, very lean sort of act, as opposed to, what the GDPR is in Europe, it's a massive sort of difference. And that's because I think India has cautiously moved away from a Eurocentric approach, because I think the way India looks at data and the way India looks at sort of data-driven business and innovation, and also just generally the culture of how Indians look at their own data is very different from what Europe looks at, in terms of privacy, in terms of security. I think security may be a little bit more, there is broad alignment, but I think in when it comes to privacy and innovation, Indians are a little bit more risk-taking, but that doesn't mean that, we're taking our data protection regimes laxly, and that doesn't mean that we maybe don't prioritize privacy as much. Privacy is a fundamental right in India. It's just that our notion to innovation is a lot more sort of appetite hungry, because we have a large cohort of SMEs that work in the digital services sector. We have Infosys, and you have these larger giants as well that we've incubated over time. So our appetite for risk, especially when it comes to data, and our appetite for looking at culturally how data is consumed in India, I think, is quite different. So I think over time, while there are sectoral regulations or more sort of sectoral policies that maybe have created corridors for alignment, I think broadly on a principle level, India has moved away from a Eurocentric approach when it comes to data protection regulation, or just largely even just technology regulations. For the most part, I don't think we ape Europe as much as we did, maybe, let's say, even as little as 5 years ago. So I would slightly have a different opinion on the matter.
Interesting, and that ties in quite nicely. Actually, we have a first question from the audience, from Felix, and he asks, how compatible are the European GDPR and the new Indian regulations on data protection? Can one assume that procedural GDPR compliance implies compliance in India? And I guess, Anisha, your answer would be not necessarily, or?
Yes, so there's 2 ways of looking at this that I would say. In terms of pure compliance, yes, if you have been GDPR compliant, is it easier to comply with the Indian data protection regulation? Absolutely, because on a principle level, there is, the principles of privacy don't change just because you change jurisdictions. They apply, right? So if you've implemented best practices, and if you've implemented sort of the principles of proportionality and accountability and transparency, of course, it makes it easier for you to comply. But just because you've followed the GDPR, does that make legal compliance in India easy? I would say no, in terms of pure institutionalization of those things. Let's say, for example, cross-border data transfers. GDPR offers a battery of options, right? From standard contractual clauses to intergroup schemes, whatever. You have a whole battery that you can list out. In India, it's very, very simple. If you're on the negative listed country, you can't transfer data. If you're not on the negative listed country, you can transfer data. It's a very simple yes or no. So I would say in terms of actual operationalization of the law, it's going to be different. And that's something your legal teams will be able to do in time. But broadly, if you've been aligning with GDPR, at least in terms from a business perspective, at least as an organization, you already have that culture built in. So that wouldn't be very different. In terms of actual maybe operationalization challenges, that would be a little different. So that's maybe my more complicated answer to that question. Yeah.
What I found interesting, Anisha, what you said also about the risk appetite, where you said, maybe Europeans are more cautious when it comes to these issues as opposed to Indians a bit more risk taking or risk tolerating. Alvis, from your perspective, would you say that is true? Can you say that way? And is regulation a reflection of that bit more cautious attitude of Europeans?
Well, I would echo what Anisha said, that the first iteration of the Indian data protection law, which largely mirrored the European GDPR, and that has, with any further iteration, when it was withdrawn by the government and then resubmitted again, it has moved further away from the European norms that have been embodied in our GDPR regarding data protection. That is, again, this is an area that Directorate General for Justice is mostly involved with the Indian counterparts. But my reading of what I have seen is that India is taking its own road, which is more divergent from where the Europeans have gone on this specific issue.
Yeah. Joel, as an Indian who has been living in Europe for quite some time, I think, what do you think? Is that a culture matter also? Are we too? I mean, are we too cautious in Europe? Are we too anxious? Maybe.
I think Indians are great negotiators, and of course, I think in terms of, I'm talking about the free trade agreement because there's something linked to all of this. At the end of the day, we want a free trade agreement as well between the EU and India, and this could be an impediment. But having said that, it would lead to further discussions. But having said that, it would. I think that the Europeans, it depends on which member state you are from. Some are very aggressive. Some have an appetite. Some have, cracked the Indian code and how to do business with India, whatever be the reforms and whatever be the regulations. There are some who are pessimistic. There are some who are, not really willing to take that flight to India, to get to India and discover India and to do business with India. They all wait for the first runners to go there. Once they have been successful, then they follow suit. So there's a lot of, it depends on where you come from. I wouldn't call it a European approach, because each member state has its own way of doing it. Like we're having a conversation about Germany. There are several German businesses in India. They are very aggressive. They all want to come to India. They see that there is a demand for their products in India, and there is there's a great profit that they're making in India. So I wouldn't say, and since we're talking about Germany, I would say that Germany is one of the, when it comes to Indians working outside of the EU, outside of India and within the EU, Germany is the first after, Germany and France are in the first and the second place when it comes to Indian investments into the EU. It used to be the UK at one point of time. That's what the statistics said, and that's what all reports were saying. But now it's Germany and France. And you can't do trade, which is unilateral. It has to be bilateral. And I see a lot of French companies and German companies also doing the same. They're all coming to India, whatever be the regulation, as a business, when you see profits and you see that there is a demand for your product and you see the size of the market in India, you will work around the regulation. And you will find a way of how to, justify yourself to be in a country like India. And I see a lot of German businesses successful in India. And when you go to any of your IFAT and you go to any of your conferences that you have in Germany, you have a huge delegation from India, and when you have an e-party in India, and on the other way around, you see a huge delegation from Germany coming to India. So I think you know, at the end of the day, a businessman looks at it differently from how policymakers look at things, and they always see the bigger picture.
Yeah, you're right, and obviously also right to point out that despite all the commonalities that we Europeans have, there are also quite a number of differences, and the amount of digital penetration or digital readiness is certainly one. Looking at Alvis from Latvia, usually people who come from the Baltic states, when they visit Germany, they're quite astonished to see how many processes are still paper-based in our country, whereas the Baltic states are famously very much at the forefront when it comes to digital.
I'm in the European Commission. I have adopted already.
Oh, okay. You've
paperwork.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's changing. It's changing.
Yeah, it is changing, but still slow. I mean, tell anyone who comes to Germany, you still need to bring cash because you can't pay electronically by any means everywhere. So these things also take some time. I would like to go back to the audience with another question about the hindrance. And the question that I have is, what is the biggest hindrance, in your opinion, to furthering digital cooperation with between India and Germany? And this is a question where you can type in any words you like. It's a so-called word cloud. So please put something in there that we have as a basis for discussion. Speaking about digital adaptability of digital technologies, this webinar is we look at topics from different perspectives, the German or European perspective in this case, and the Indian, but we also look a lot about on things about mutual learning. So what can we learn from each other? And whenever I go to India, I'm always not surprised, but always comes to mind is the amount of digital penetration when it comes to services. And I think the most obvious one maybe is UPI, the payment infrastructure that has been implemented as a public service essentially, and that is literally used by, I would say, almost every one of the 1.4 billion Indians. You can pay everywhere with it, from large stores to basically street food stalls. Is that something, Joel, maybe that you'd love to have more of in Europe? Is this kind of digital entrepreneurship mentality, providing digital services, implementing them at scale?
Absolutely. I mean, coming from the city of Mumbai, where almost everyone accepts a digital form of payment, and then moving to Brussels, I thought it would be, a little more advanced, or equally as advanced as India and as Mumbai. I beg to differ. It was, I see that, here as well, they all prefer accepting cash. And I think the digital systems that we have in India are more robust compared to what we have in the EU. We talk about data protection and data privacy and all of that, yes, but at the end of the day, we are I'm talking about the EU. We are so I would say outdated sometimes even in the platforms that we use here. That I think India can be a shining example for the Europeans on how to manage these applications. And I always, in any of my discussions online and even in person, I always tell people in the EU that Indians are great when it comes to ICT. They are great when it comes to this topic. Use them just like how the Indians use the Germans for all these machine products. Your 4.0 machines that you have, Industry 4.0 that you came out with. I mean, it's great. So the Indians see that, and they all want the German product. Similarly, the Germans and then the Europeans should look at India and say, hey, you guys have the best IT systems and IT management tools and applications. Why don't you come here and help our governments? And not only the governments, but even the other banking sectors to improve our applications, because that eases the life of a lot of people, and it really helps in a big way, particularly for the small and mid-sized businesses. So SMEs as well do benefit from it. a lot of Indian startups are now looking at coming to the EU. We see a lot of them in this payment gateway platforms that we call them in India. They are all approaching the EU. They are all looking at countries, particularly since we have a colleague from Estonia, no, from Latvia, but there's also Estonia that they are coming to, which is opening up its doors for Indian startups to come to the EU. So yeah, I guess this is a good bilateral transfer of intelligence from both sides.
Let's have a look at the word cloud and see what our audience believes are the biggest obstacles when it comes to furthering digital cooperation between India and Germany. So we have culture. That is the biggest obstacle. Interesting. So that leads us back to what we discussed initially, that maybe there are different kinds of approaches. Data is named second, whatever that means. Data obviously is very much at the heart of digital cooperation. A few other things: data security, bureaucracy, no regulatory bodies, digital inclusion. That's also an interesting topic. Maybe we can touch upon that in a moment. Transaction fees. Okay, yeah. I mean, this I think is one of the big advantages of UPI, for example, that it has very, very low, I think, transaction fees. Anisha, you work also on the ethical part a lot on of digital transformation technology. Digital inclusion was mentioned. Is that an issue? How do you see India on that front? Is the glass half full or is it half empty? Is it great that so many people have access to, for example, UPI and other services, or is there still an issue that we risk leaving people behind because they don't have equitable access to these services and the infrastructure?
I think that's maybe the most complicated question I've probably had to tackle, because I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. When we were talking to Joel about UPI sort of penetration in India and how that's taken up so well, I think it goes back to my first point of risk taking, because there's a need and necessity in India. There's no other way to make it work but to mass deploy it and kind of do the social experiment and see if it works. Now, will that have downsides? Absolutely. There is a significant amount of UPI-based frauds in India, where folks from, let's say, financially insecure backgrounds are sometimes duped into giving their sort of daily wages or income, and the victims of social engineering frauds, for example. So does that happen? Absolutely. But has that also meant that a huge swaths of Indian sort of the communities that are from the financially non-inclusive background suddenly have bank accounts? All of a sudden, everyone has had to make a bank account because that's the only way in which you can do UPI transactions. And that means that all of India's middle class suddenly using UPI does not use cash-based payments. So a maid coming home, or let's say your gardener who comes home, or your driver, or a street vendor, everyone is suddenly, formal or informally, they all have bank accounts. Right. And that happened only because of UPI. Right. And there's another version of this, which is UHI, which is also going to be launched, which is the United Health Interface. Right. You get to get a UHI ID. So everyone in India suddenly is given a health interface ID, which means that a lot of folks that would not have access to good healthcare suddenly is getting sort of onboarded onto a system in which they have access to timely healthcare, right? And easily accessible healthcare, and healthcare that's cheap, which is very important in a country like India. So yes, digital inclusion has forced Indian citizens in some way to be also digitally literate, in that they all have mobile phones, and suddenly they're being taught how to use it through different entities, either through government or through suddenly, let's say, let me just use this example, right? So RBI is our sort of financial regulator. It's the Reserve Bank of India. Through the Reserve Bank, through the Chamber of Commerce, through the banks as well, everyone is being taught how to use basic banking infrastructure. Every single person who comes on board and signs with an account or is trying to take out a loan, everyone is taught. And slowly, people are getting educated as they go along. Awareness is a big part of this, right? And so folks that might not necessarily have gone to school still know how to use a phone, still know what to press on, still know how to read basic, sort of basic tabs and basic sort of UPI transaction things. So they know when to put in their UPIN, or they know when to, how to transfer particular payments. So digital inclusion is a very, very interesting conversation in India, in that we've kind of deployed this mass experiment on people, and we're hoping that it'll work. There are downsides to it. Yes, there are communities that are still left out. There are vulnerable populations that will always have challenges, right? So women, or people of particular ethnicities, or people, let's say, of particular disabilities, and children, all of the vulnerable populations will always have it one step worse. But I think there's no other way in which to do it in India but to do it this way. And for the most part, we've had success with it. Right, broadly, even with UPI frauds, with a country that has a digital illiteracy, or just broadly illiteracy as high as India, we've seen our fraud rates are very, very low compared to the global standards. Right, so what the citizen can't do for itself, I feel, in India, not through a paternalistic government, but through regulators regulating so strongly, we solve the problem of the citizen. We don't put the burden of responsibility on the citizen, which I think is another difference between, I'm so sorry, I'm taking time, but I realize another difference between maybe the European model and the Indian model. For example, consent, right? Where European model, everything goes back to consent. In India, we're like, if security is good enough, you don't need consent at every stage. Consent fatigue is a real problem, and especially in a country where there is significant illiteracy, where people aren't literate about their digital rights, and maybe don't even have the bandwidth to fully understand, or maybe they just even don't care. There is a responsibility on the government and the regulator, and I think that's where India maybe has moved a step ahead, in that we don't put the ownership of security or the ownership of data protection or privacy purely on the citizen. There's a lot of it that the regulator and the government takes on itself as well. Yeah, so I'm so sorry. I think I've gone a fair bit out of my answer, but
No,
it's a complicated question.
That's good and fair, and I understand that your argument is that indeed the glass is half full rather than half empty when it comes to social inclusion. And you also rightly pointed out, in India, everything, or a lot of things work by experimentation and by scale. Obviously, also that's another important thing. Everything is huge, obviously, in India. Lots of people involved in everything that happens. But that's interesting, and it's also interesting what you said about the consent issue, because I would argue that one could also question to what extent, for example, Europeans really consent in an active way. If you ask yourself, who actually reads all those terms that you agree to, and all these cookie banners and whatnot, you click on OK. I think hardly anyone probably really reads and thinks them through. I would like to touch upon another issue that is also related to the UPI interface, and that is the question is about the infrastructure and whose responsibility it is to provide digital infrastructure. So the Indian model with UPI is basically that the infrastructure, the underlying technical infrastructure, is a public good that is provided as an open platform, essentially through the state. Alvis, is that something that you believe the Europeans should also go for when it comes to not just payment infrastructure, but generally, let's say, digital infrastructure per se?
Well, here in the Commission, you may be aware that we are working towards the e-wallet, which is not really mimicking the UPI or Indian Aadhaar system, although we do recognize the success story that the Indians have put in place. And by the way, under the Trade and Technology Council, both sides have agreed to work on digital public infrastructures together to enhance interoperability between what we are doing here in Europe and what the Indians have successfully done. Of course, there are questions, as has been mentioned, questions around security and privacy, where in Europe we are much more cautious than the Indian side is. Nevertheless, we have already held at the end of September the first workshop. The Commission and our Indian counterparts on digital identity. We discussed digital identity, what are the Indian solutions, what are our European solutions, and also on the interoperability. And we have agreed to continue to work towards the next steps. Also, next workshops where we could discuss digital identity, which is an important step, when you travel between both countries. If it's a comparable digital identity, driver's license, for instance, that would make life easier, and also digital payment use cases. That is also what we are looking into. Although, as I reiterate that from the European side, again, the security and privacy are issues that we need to take into account. But regarding your question, whether it should be open source or not, I don't think I'm qualified enough to respond to that. As a private citizen, obviously, I would favor that approach.
Okay, no, that's fine. We all speak in our personal capacities here, not as official spokespersons of our organization. So that is fine. Joe, as someone who represents private business, at least indirectly, I believe, through Eurochambres, what's your take? I mean, is it kind of this public goods model, or is it more the US approach where a lot of technology is, or basically all of technology is provided through private enterprise? What would you favor?
I would prefer the public approach. And, in terms of what's happening around the world, not only the EU-India corridor, we are talking about Africa coming out with one single currency. We are talking about ASEAN looking at it as one single currency. These are things that are being discussed. When the BRICS came out and they had that meeting during just before the G20 summit, there was a lot of talk as to how certain countries came to that discussion, how a certain country is part of the BRICS discussion. And I think, the Europeans, and I'm talking about the EU, and not to badmouth the EU or the European Commission because I work very closely with them, I think they're very slow. So I think Africa will have will do it, and India and ASEAN will do it. And I think then after that, probably you'll have the Europeans waking up and saying, hey, this makes sense for us as a public good, and they may adopt such a platform across the EU. You see, I mean, I think as a public good, it may take a lot of time for it. Private sector has already started to do it within the EU, but then again, within the EU, it's a member state driven. They take the initiative and it's done. But otherwise, as a pan EU or a pan Europe kind of an approach, it may take a lot of time, because as Alvis just mentioned, they're talking about the e-wallet. They've been talking about the e-wallet for a very long time. It's something which needs to be done quickly, because in terms of digital and in terms of newer technologies, they are just booming, and they're coming every day. There's something new coming out. So if you really take time to discuss, you've missed the bus. So that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Yeah, speed is indeed an interesting topic. I just wanted to encourage our audience, if you have questions to ask to our panelists, please do so. We'll show you the QR code and the URL again, where you can go and you can type in your question, and we will then pose it to our audience. And I think, Joel, the speed that you mentioned, the speed of transformation is of course astonishing. And I think regulation, for example, to a certain extent always follows developments, but of course the faster the developments happen, the more any regulation kind of lags behind. So I want to touch about another very, very hotly discussed topic in the realm of digital transformation, and that is, of course, artificial intelligence. We've all seen it. It's nothing new, but for about a year now, it's really been at the forefront since the launch, or the public launch, of ChatGPT, which I think the publicly available version was launched pretty much about a year ago. And we've all seen, even within that 12 months period, the enormous progress that has been made, not just with this platform, but also with other language models that have come up or have been opened up in the past months. And some people are enthusiastic about it, about the possibilities that we have for increased productivity, and so on and so forth. We've also heard a lot about, one would say, even dystopian visions of the future, where some people say that AI might take over. So the dark vision of, if you've ever seen Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001, Odyssey in Space, which is a rather old movie, where machines then suddenly take over, that this might actually happen now, and we need to regulate it. Now the EU has been at the forefront of regulating that. I think the first entity or the first region in the world to come up with a regulatory framework. Question, maybe starting with Anisha, looking at us from India. Do you think that's even possible to regulate such a fast-moving field such as AI?
I mean, India has also been trying to do this for a while. Strangely, we had discussions about regulating AI while we still didn't have a data protection law, which was very strange for a lot of Indians, because we didn't yet have a data protection law, but we were already thinking about how to regulate emerging technologies, drones, all sorts of things, robotics. And a big component of that was how are we going to regulate AI? And yes, I think the answer to this question, at least from a policy perspective, would be you can't have one broad scope law, like let's say a telecom regulation that regulates all of AI. That I don't think is the useful way to look at it. It's more interesting, I think, maybe in that sense, I think India should align with Europe in that Europe has always had legislations or regulations that have led from a principle first use case. It's always, these are the broad principles and the contours of what should not be done. And from there, we will start building laws, and there we will start thinking about things. And I think AI specifically is one of those fields where you can have broad scope principles of what should be there, and let's say our responsibilities as citizens or responsibilities as businesses or broad responsibilities. But I don't think you can write any sort of prescriptive regulation around this, because you're just not going to be able to unless you have a regulator in some way that's constantly coming out with policies and revamping things, which again, the usefulness of that is something else that we'll have to think about. And I think the big challenge with AI regulation, even if countries start coming out with this, is going to be interoperability of that regulation, because no one's going to come up with a similar framework. I feel like India's temperament towards AI will be very, very different from Europe's temperament towards AI, because the same way we look at data is the same way we're going to look at AI. We're going to look at it from an innovation first perspective. And if, especially in a country where, we can use AI to solve a lot of problems, let's say manual scavenging, for example, is still a big problem in India, right? If we can use AI to solve that issue, we are going to want to do it. Right. So our appetite towards AI also is going to be, we have to give solutions that make our citizens safer. And so any sort of interoperable framework might be a challenge. Again, I think that will probably be the more difficult thing to regulate when it comes to AI regulation. But yeah, I think the way to go about it is to think about it from a principle first to the principle based approach.
Joel, in Europe, some people have said, in light of the recent attempts to regulate AI, is that from a European perspective, that's actually counterproductive, because a lot of the research, a lot of the companies that work on the field will go elsewhere. They will, technologies will be developed elsewhere, and this argument says basically that in the end, Europeans are shooting themselves in the foot, because we will kill our own nascent AI industry, and we will be dependent on technology that is controlled or has been developed elsewhere, in the US, in China, maybe in India, wherever that may be. What do you say to that? Is that a valid concern?
It is a valid concern. A lot of European businesses have already moved to the US because they felt that they were not getting the right policy frameworks over here or the policy structures over here. Most of the policies that are coming out by the policymakers in different member states as well as the EU, they don't discuss it with business. The lack of interaction with business, and particularly when you talk about innovation and AI and all of that, you need to talk to the businesses when you are creating your policies, because if you're going to be restrictive in a sector like ICT and digital, people have other avenues and doors to that are waiting and open for them. And also a country like India is open for EU innovation and EU businesses, so just like the US. So I guess it should be, and we at Eurochambres, whenever the Commission comes out with any policies, we support the SMEs, and we want to ensure that they have the best interest. So we push back to the Commission. We have policy papers and position papers coming out that talk about how does it affect the EU SMEs. So I see a lot of pushback on some of the policy recommendations that come out, but this is because we are in touch through the chamber network with all of the SMEs in Europe. So we have this kind of a discussion. Of course, there are times when we are successful, but there are times when we also approach the Commission and tell them that this is the pain points from the EU SMEs, and if they do not do something, the SMEs are going to find other avenues and other doors and other countries to do business in.
Just to add to Joel's
Alvis,
point,
I just
actually,
want to, Alvis, do you want to comment on that? I don't want to put you on the spot as the representative of the EU Commission here, but just in case you want to react to what Joel has said.
Well, on AI specifically and AI Act, the European legislation, I'm not really in that directorate or unit dealing with that. I wouldn't be able to rebut or confirm the concerns. So I'm just coordinating the relations with India. But on AI, I must add that we, under the TTC again, artificial intelligence is one of the items that is taken up, and from the European perspective, we like bilateral cooperation with India on trustworthy and responsible AI, and also we are open to sharing practices and approaches to ethical AI. That is what we do with India, and in addition, both sides have agreed also to coordinate positions in a international body called GPAI, Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. So that's broadly what I would add. Thank you.
I would like to go back to our audience one more time for a final question from them. And the question is the following. Should there be an international e-governance organization? So that's quite interesting in light of the discrepancies. Is that the solution, or is that just illusoric? Anisha, what do you think?
I mean, you see, I think it's useful if the goal is to come out with frameworks. I think a body like that would be useful, but that's as far as I'd go. I don't understand how, you'd be able to make this body function. I don't understand what this body would be able to do apart from suggesting frameworks, which is already being suggested by plenty of organizations and bodies across the world. It's not like there's a dearth of that. It's just that adopting it and actually making it happen is a very jurisdiction specific thing, because all countries suddenly, we thought that digitization is going to make the world interconnected and everyone's going to get on the same platform. I think we've gone in the opposite direction, and that everyone suddenly is looking at digitization as a tool for what's interesting to their country and what their priorities, their internal priorities are. And they've suddenly used this as this sort of pawn in the game, right? They're like, okay, this is what's interesting to us. If you can map what we want, then you're allowed to play, but otherwise you're not. So I don't understand what the scope of this e-governance body would be apart from suggesting frameworks, and that's not something that, there's a dearth of. There's plenty of that. So yeah, I don't think that'll fix a problem per se. What I think would be more useful would again maybe adopting a European sort of model of principles where everybody broadly aligns with, okay, these are the principles. As long as we all commit to those principles but do it differently, that's okay. I think right now we don't also all commit to the same principles. We have different goals and different ambitions in mind. Yeah, I think I don't think any governance body would fix a problem.
Okay. Good. Thank you very much, Anisha. We've already come to the end of today's webinar. So I would like to, first of all, thank my three panelists for all their input, their interesting comments and opinions. We couldn't touch upon all the issues, I think, because it's such a large topic. And also, as we've seen, it's a very fast moving. So I guess this topic lends itself to a follow-up conversation on this platform, maybe in a year or so, where we look at the progress that we've made. Thanks also to our audience for the questions, for being active participants. Thank you very much for that. And as always, you can go to our website, sign up to our mailing list. The website is at Indo-German.Centre. Other than that, we will have another installment in a month, and I hope that many of you will join us there again. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.